we finished up the last project with the Winchester Silvertip Hollow Point 9mm 115 grain loads, and we're using, I've got this bottle of 231 that's got that much. It's been sitting around too long. Powder's fine, but it's got an 09 date code, and I don't need to be sitting on the stuff forever, so let's just start using it up. And so I'm explaining a bunch of stuff along the way. So if you're newer, or even if you've been loading for a long time, hopefully you'll learn something here. So next, as long as I've got the Redding T7 set up with some Redding 9mm dies, I'm going to continue on with that 9mm stuff because I have hanging around here some brand new old stock 9mm unprimed casings. Now, if you've read Guns and Ammo or some of the old gun magazines where Elmer Keith was writing articles in those, you may have read articles by Elmer Keith where he talked about the Santa Ana gun room, where they would put on gun shows there, and you get people from all over the country who were, big in the gun industry who would go down there, and then they'd barbecue, they'd have a great time, and then they'd go down to the ocean, they'd get on a boat. And then Elmer would write about how they went out into the ocean and he would shoot sharks. And he would describe just how to do it. And of course, he was using his 44 mag because that was his signature thing. 240 grain semi-wad cutter Keith bullets, using 2400 was the powder, by the way, if you care. But he would describe exactly how to go about doing this so you could have success shooting sharks from a boat out on the ocean. Boy, the world used to be different. But the only reason I'm bringing that up is because I happen to have in my hand right here a box of brand new, unprimed Norma 9mm casings from, yes, the Santa Ana gun room. Now, that's made by Norma. Norma is in Sweden. I happen to think, I'm of the opinion that Norma makes really good quality stuff. A lot of good quality stuff, by the way, does come from Sweden and has for a long time. A lot of the Alliant powders, Bullseye and Unique, which are probably among the most popular powders on the planet, have been for a very, very long time, were made in Sweden. Now here I have also a box of Herder's 9mm new unprimed brass. Now, Herder's, if you recall, or maybe you don't know, they were big in the catalog order stuff, kind of like Sears and Roebuck or whatever, but they would cater more to the working class where, if you don't have a lot of money, you can get Herder's products. You could order them through the mail or whatever. They were in Waseca, Minnesota. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, I know of Herder's, they didn't have that great of stuff. You look at the old, like Reloading catalogs and you see their stuff was a lot cheaper than a lot of others. Well, that's true. They made decent stuff, but don't lose sight of the fact that just because it says Herder's, this isn't great stuff, because I want you to notice that it says made in Sweden. Now, if you know these guys make high quality stuff and they're made in Sweden, and Herder's, which has a Herder's head stamp on the brass, is made in Sweden, who do you think made it? There was only one company doing that back in the day. So if this cost X and this was cheaper, just so you know, I digress. So I've got some older, brand new old stock casings, and I want to do something, I was thinking, that's going to be more local, because this was from the Santa Ana gun room. Now, Sierra Bullets used to be here in Southern California. They were in Santa Fe Springs. And as this box from back in the day says right there on the front, if that's hard to read, it says, established May 14th, 1917, Santa Fe Springs, California, Sierra Bullets. Now, I don't happen to have some 9mm, and I wanted to do 124 grain because I've got a specific purpose in mind for these loads that I want to do with this brass. I'm thinking I want to shoot steel targets that move and swing and just do stuff. Now, personally, when I'm shooting steel or targets that move or do stuff rather than like just a piece of paper, I like to have a little bit heavier bullet with a little lower velocity, because a lot of times I like to move pretty fast. And just, if you have a heavier bullet with lighter, I'm going to call the recoil more of a push and less of a snap. Now, still my job to control recoil, you know. But if I can get this much help by doing a heavier bullet with a lighter powder charge, I'll take it. That way I can just move a little bit faster on steel. And with a steel target, by the way, if it's this big and it went there instead of there, I don't care. I hit the target and it did its thing. But I don't happen to have an old box of Sierras from that time. But for what I want to do, I've got some bullets that I've got a partial from a 500 count box of Acura 124 grain target hollow points. Now, this type of a hollow point is not designed for personal defense rapid expansion. You've got more mass in the back than you do up front, and it works really well for the purpose that I'm putting this load together for. So again, I'm going to use Winchester 231, but just for grins and giggles, I grabbed, let's say I did have an old box of Sierra 124 grains, which, by the way, back in that day, Sierra didn't do 124 grain bullet. They did 9mm 90 and 115 grain bullets only. And this manual, which was published in 1971, has data for 9mm, but the powders, now the list is a little bit small. They've got the real common ones, Bullseye, Unique, and some of those that you see listed there, they just don't even exist anymore. But again, I want to use up this stuff that's been hanging around for too long. I need to do something with it. So I'm going back to my Winchester manual for the 231, and they do have 124 grain bullet data in this book that I have in my hand right here. But it brings up kind of an interesting question. I've got some bullets that I want to load, and I've got data for lighter bullets, but I don't have data for heavier bullets for the powder I want to use. How do I figure out what would be a safe powder charge to load my heavier bullets? So this is one way you can figure this out. There's others. I mean, all the math people out there are going to, you're probably going to cringe and start yelling at the screen right now, but this is the way I've done it. I have data here for 95 grain, 115 grain, 124 grain, 147 grain bullets. Now, I'm not using Bullseye that they have listed here, and if I'm confusing you by going back and forth with my whole thing about wanting to be period correct with what I happen to have here, I'll shut up about that right now, because I don't want to leave you, what did he just say? What I'm talking about is figuring out an appropriate powder charge for a heavier bullet when they only have data for the powder that you're going to use for the lighter bullets, right? So we look at, and I'm going to use this Winchester catalog as an example. So using Winchester 231 with a 115 grain bullet, the maximum powder charge is 4.9. Now, if I go up to a 124 grain bullet, 4.5 is the maximum powder charge. So I just reduced from 4.9 to 4.5, which is 4/10 of 1 grain for a 10 grain bullet weight increase. So let's say now I want to load 147 grain bullets. Well, it was 10, and that's more than 10. Is that extra 3 grains of bullet weight really going to make a difference? No. No, you can do the same thing. We'll just pretend it says 145 and not 147. If you started weighing all of those bullets, by the way, just because the box says 147 grain, that doesn't mean they're all 147 grain bullets. Try it sometime. You'll see they're not as consistent as you might think. But let's get back to the point here. So if we reduced from 4.9 to 4.5, 4/10 of 1 grain for a 10 grain increase in bullet weight, if I want to load 147 grain bullets, how much do I reduce it? 4/10 of a grain. So we're going to say now that our maximum powder charge is 4.1 if we're shooting 147 instead of the 124, which is what our data maxed out at. Now remember, that's going to be maximum. Typically, when you get these freebie pamphlets, or even if you buy a bottle of powder and there's a load right there on the bottle, it tells you exactly what powder charge for the grain weight of the bullet that they have shown. That's always a maximum powder charge. If you only have one load, not the minimum with the maximum that tells you what your safe range is, if you have one load, it's always maximum. Reduce that by 10%, and now you've got your starting powder charge. Are you tracking with me here? So let's say I want to load that 147 grain bullet instead of the 124. Again, I dropped my maximum powder charge to 4.5 grains to 4.1 grains. I reduced that by 10%. There's my starting powder charge. And that is a safe thing to do. Now, there's other ways of figuring out what's an appropriate powder charge when you don't have specific data for that powder for that particular grain weight. But if you have data for the exact same powder in the exact same caliber, and you don't flip-flop this back and forth from another cartridge. Let's say you wanted to use, the same data because 38 Super Automatic is pretty close. No, it's not. It's a different animal. Stay with apples and apples and oranges to oranges, so to speak. Don't go from 380 to 9 and think the data is interchangeable. It isn't. So reduce it by the amount that they reduced it from the lighter to the heavier bullet or the next weight, and keep the increments the same. Now, 3 grains of bullet weight isn't enough to really make any difference. Generally, it gets to 5 grains of bullet weight where it starts to matter. And if you do, you're not sure, play it safe. Drop it another 1/10 of a grain, and you're going to be in safe territory. But you always reduce it 10% to begin with anyway, work your way back up. And of course, when you go to the range, you're going to look for all those pressure signs. You know what the pressure signs are that you're looking for, right? We'll talk about that too. If you don't, happy trails.